Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Bruce. So I'm going to momentarily interrupt the spirit of rest. And before we get into the sermon proper, look at a little phrase that we sometimes let slide by in that Exodus passage, but that we're no longer going to allow to slide by. And you'll notice that in the Ten Commandments it says that that day of rest shall be for you and your household and your animals and your slaves. And can we just stop for a moment and recognize that slavery was never okay? Getting a little agitated lately that there seems to be a cottage industry that's kind of risen up of apologists for our forefathers, and sometimes foremothers, but mostly forefathers, in the faith and in our nation, owning other people to do their work for them. And we can say, well, they didn't know better. That's just the way it was. I imagine if they had asked the people in slavery, they would have known better. These 10 Commandments were given to the people of Israel who just a few years earlier had been enslaved themselves. So they knew what slavery was. Well, maybe that wasn't the same kind of slavery that we understand it to be now. Maybe not. But can we agree that it's never right to own somebody else? Can we agree, and I don't want to conflate these two things, but I want to recognize that there's a wisp of a line between the two. Can we agree that it's never right to physically and financially exploit another person for our own gain? We've got to remember that, and we've got to be speaking up every time it pops up. And it's going to pop up because slavery has always been a part of all of our cultures. But we have to be very careful to remind ourselves at every turn that it's not okay. Our God is a God of abundance. Our God is a God of enough for all, as is demonstrated in this concept of the Sabbath. So a couple of caveats right off the bat is, one is I'm basically talking out of my butt with this because this is something that I struggle with profoundly and I have not figured it out yet. So I'll just give you that. And also I'll recognize that I'm speaking to mostly people that are not in the workforce anymore. So you might have a different relationship with this idea of Sabbath and the importance of taking a day off. So a couple things. First of all, there are things in this that we can all connect with as we look at the larger picture of Sabbath. Second of all, will you send this to a child or a grandchild that still is working 7 days a week? And maybe they can glean something from it. So we've been talking the past several weeks about Brene Brown's book, The Gifts of Imperfection, and her 10 guideposts for wholehearted living. So what she did is she took people that lived wholeheartedly, lived with their full selves, people that were enjoying and relishing life, and seeing what are some commonalities between all of those folks. And one of those commonalities, which turned into a guidepost, is the importance of rest and the importance of play. She said sometimes as she was looking at these studies and reading about these wholehearted people, it felt like she was in a foreign country because a lot of times she didn't even understand what they were talking about. And so this was one of those areas. So she looked at the data and she was talking to her assistants and she was saying, you know, these wholehearted people, they just seem to fool around a whole lot. And so her assistant says, well, what do you mean? They play sports? They engage in hobbies? And she says, yeah, it's kind of like that, but much more casual. They spend time doing things that there is absolutely no point to. And she said, just the very thought of doing that produces anxiety in me. I can't imagine doing that. And yet in her research, she discovered that that was incredibly important. It was important for well-being and wholeheartedness, important for even brain development and opening up our imagination and invigorating our souls. So, isn't it amazing that research done in 2011 reflects the sacred wisdom that we've had for the past 3,000 years? From the very beginning stories that we tell about where we came from, we're told in the first creation poem that God took 6 days, and we're told what he created in each of those 6 days, and that each of those things that God created was good. And then what happened on the seventh day? What happened on the seventh day? God rested. God woke up on the seventh morning, and God was cooked. God was done. God took a day to rest. It was so important that as the people of Israel started to codify what it meant to live with one another and with God, and to live with dignity and respect for all, says on the sixth day, the seventh day, you stop. You rest. You don't do any work. Codified into our very existence, baked into who we are as a society. And of course, religion then got into the picture, as religion always does, and always messes things up to some extent. So we took what was supposed to be a day of pleasure and rest and turned it into a day of more rules to follow, and came up with all kind of codes of what you could or you couldn't do on that day. And then of course Jesus comes along and upends everything, and he's healing folks, and he's picking kernels of corn with his disciples to eat on that Sabbath day so they can be nourished, so that they could be refreshed. Jesus knew how to rest. Jesus knew how to play. You have to kind of read between the lines, but one of the criticisms of Jesus is that he hung out with gluttons and drunkards. Jesus knew how to play. Jesus knew how to engage in activities that were just enjoyable, with no point whatsoever, but to be at rest and to be with one another. So, how might we practice that in our day and age? And I know this group, there's a lot of you that have figured that out and do just a fantastic job of that, in balancing your purpose and the activities that you're engaged in, and also stepping back and resting. Peter Scazzaro has written on the emotionally healthy spiritual life and emotionally healthy discipleship. Such helpful thoughts as we engage our spiritual lives, but he talks a lot about Sabbath. And here are the 4 things that he suggests. First is just to stop. We stop. Are there going to be things that are left undone? Indeed, there are. And they'll be there tomorrow for us to pick back up. You know, one of the greatest things that I gained out of our trips to Biloxi which, who knows, we might be taking again now. But we, for a couple of years, went up and helped rebuild houses that had been damaged by Katrina. And there was a project manager there. And he was, as we were orienting, and he gave us the explanations of what we were going to be doing, there were at least 2 or 3 houses or structures that we were working on every time that we went up. And he was quick to remind us that it's the middle of summer in Mississippi. It's hot. You take your time. You're not going to start on one house and finish it. He said, before you got here, there was a group last week that started on some of these houses. And after you leave next week, there's another group that's going to come and is going to continue the work that we're doing. We're not responsible for finishing everything. We're responsible for engaging what we're called to do. There's folks that have come before us. There's folks that are going to come after us. There's others that we work with that will join us in the work that we're doing. Sometimes we need to just stop. First thing is we stop. The second thing is that we rest. We do things that are enjoyable. We do things, as Brene Brown was talking about, for things that have no point. One of those things I've shared with y'all for me on Saturday mornings is kayaking. And it's really hard to do things without a point. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I forgot my watch, which tracks the exercise time that I put in. So I felt the need to go back and get my watch and put it on so I would get credit for the kayaking that I was doing on that Saturday morning. And that's where we end up sometimes. But there's times just to rest. There's times just to take a nap. Emerson had a friend come over yesterday, and he wanted biscuits and sausage gravy, and I haven't done that forever, and because it takes a little bit of time that I could be spending doing things that I, quote, need to do. But just in that process yesterday of making those biscuits and gravy, there was some peace. There was some refreshment that came along with that. We rest. We stop. We rest. We delight. We have some fun. We engage in activities that bring us joy and bring us pleasure. You know, we talked about that a little bit last week with the artist date, but whether that's going to a museum or whether that's going outside somewhere, whether that's sitting and binging a half a season or so on Netflix, whether that's canoodling with a loved one that we have at home, what brings you delight? What brings you pleasure? And how might you engage in that? And then the fourth aspect he talks about is contemplating. Just reflecting. And so you notice in my conversation about Sabbath, I haven't mentioned God so much during that. And I think that's because sometimes we equate Sabbath so much with God that we forget about the rest. Oh yeah, I know what Sabbath is. That's when we go to church. Well, yeah. We might gather to worship on that day. We might gain nourishment from that. I do. I mean, that hymn that we were singing this morning, to come and find the quiet center. Oh my goodness. You know, that's gonna nourish me for the week. But that's not the only thing that we do. But we do contemplate. We do reflect. We think about how our lives connect with the divine. Connect with the larger. That's really hard to do when we're rushing to get our work done. There's other ways and other spiritual practices that we can take up to do that, and they're all important. But Sabbath is a big one. Just to remind ourselves, for me to remind myself, you know what, Jason? It's not all up to you. And you're a fool to think that it is. That's what Sabbath does for us. We stop, we rest, we delight, we contemplate. We do that because, yes, it is important for us in our own well-being, in our own wholeheartedness, in our own ability to continue in the work that we're called to do. But the Sabbath picture is so much bigger than that. Walter Brueggemann says, the Sabbath is a suspension of production and consumption in order to get our depleted life back. Rabbi Joshua Heschel, an incredible teacher who just died in the past few years, describes the Sabbath as a quiet day, free from the profanity of clattering commerce, of being yoked to toil. He, the one observing the Sabbath, must go away from the screech of dissonant days, from the nervousness and fury of acquisitiveness, and the betrayal of embezzling one's own life. It is, he says, a day of armistice in the economic struggle with our fellow men and the forces of nature. Brene Brown puts this in language that's a little bit easier for us normal folks to understand. She, with her family, had 2 lists. So she made a list of, if our life was to be exactly as we want it to be, what would it look like? So one of the things on the list is we would sleep more. We would have time to work out. We would have time to engage in activities that we enjoy. We would have more time to putter. That's what we would want our life to look like. And then she pulled out the list that she and her husband had made of what they thought their dream life would be. The kind of house that they wanted, the salary level that they would be at, what they wanted to acquire. And she said, why would we trade the one list of who and what we want to be for this other list of just what we think we might want? And so they made changes in their family as to how they would operate and what they would do. It's time for us to take a rest, Sabbath is, but it's also time for all of creation to take a rest. Sabbath is a spiritual practice. It's an environmental practice as well, where we take a day and we stop consuming. There's much to criticize about Chick-fil-A, and we have, and we will continue. But a practice that they have is stopping on Sunday. And I know that's always when you want a chicken sandwich. But they're closed on Sunday. And that's a great example. So here's a day a week. Our system in so many aspects is what it is, and we look at it and we say, oh my goodness, we can't change that. We're wrong about that. But that is a reality of our existence. We're caught up in this system and it's like we can't get out. But can we take a day off from it? Can we take a day and practice kingdom living? Can we take a day and practice that there's something other than the bottom line? In the case of Chick-fil-A, can we take a day and stop killing chickens and exploiting underpaid workers and driving our cars and polluting the planet to go and get that chicken sandwich? Can we take a day and not fill the coffers of those who would give their money to causes to which we are not in alliance with? And what would that feel like? And can we pay attention to what it feels like not to participate in that system? That is what Sabbath is. That's what God intended from the very beginning for Sabbath to be. How might we practice it? How might we live into it for the wholeheartedness and sanity of our own lives, for the healing of those around us, and for the healing of the planet? I think one of the greatest realizations for me in this series is there are plenty of times when the science and the data come in line with the ancient wisdom of Scripture. How will we respond? Let's pray together.